How one soldier's bluff saved an army and forged a legend. Prologue: The Edge of Annihilation. The cold in the Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a living entity, a crystalline, penetrating force that seeped through wool uniforms, leather boots, and human resolve. It was a cold that made bones ache, that turned breath into plumes of ghostly vapor, that froze machine oil and numbed fingers until trigger pulls became acts of sheer will. Into this frozen landscape, Adolf Hitler had cast his final desperate gamble in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a massive surprise offensive through the densely wooded Ardennes, aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. By December 22nd, the spearhead of that offensive had driven a deep bulge into Allied lines and encircled a critical Belgian crossroads town, Bastogne. Holding it was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units. They were surrounded, outnumbered nearly 5-1 in some sectors, low on ammunition, medical supplies, and winter gear. The skies were a low leaden ceiling, denying them close air support or resupply. Their situation was, in the words of one historian, strategically dire and tactically desperate. That morning, under a flag of truce, a German delegation delivered an ultimatum to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Surrender within 2 hours or face total annihilation. McAuliffe's legendary laconic reply, "Nuts," would become a rallying cry of American defiance. But defiance alone does not hold ground against panzer divisions. The German response to the rejection was immediate and brutal. A concentrated artillery bombardment that shook the frozen earth of Bastogne, followed by intensified infantry probes along the thinly stretched American perimeter. On the western edge of this shrinking defensive circle, along a snow-choked secondary road leading into the town, the situation was particularly precarious. Here, the line was held not by a full company of entrenched paratroopers, but a small specialized unit, the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 423rd Infantry Regiment. They were scouts and radio operators, trained for stealth and information gathering, not for anchoring a main line of resistance against armored assault. Their commander was a 24-year-old lieutenant from Michigan named Harold Joseph Moore. As the artillery barrage lifted and an eerie silence descended, broken only by the moan of the wind, the men of the INR platoon peered into the thick, mist-shrouded pine forest. The rumble of diesel engines, unmistakably German Panzers, grew louder from the west. Through the ghostly trees, shadows moved, the silhouettes of advancing infantry. Moore, looking at his 18 cold, exhausted men and their few light weapons, knew a direct firefight would be over in minutes. He had no anti-tank guns, no mortars in support, no reserve to call upon. His eyes fell on the platoon's prized piece of equipment, the bulky, powerful SCR-499 radio, its generator humming softly. It was a link to division headquarters miles away, a tool for reporting what he saw. But in that moment of supreme crisis, Hal Moore saw it as something else entirely. It was not just a receiver of information, but a transmitter of reality. He made a decision that would depart from every standard doctrine of warfare. He would not fight the enemy he could see. He would battle the one inside their minds. He would build an army of phantoms. This is the story of that decision and the 48 hours that followed. It is a story that transcends the simple narrative of battlefield courage, venturing into the psychological heart of conflict. It is a tale of how one man, armed with little more than a microphone, a keen understanding of human doubt, and a breathtaking capacity for audacity, orchestrated a symphony of deception that helped bend the course of the largest battle fought by the United States Army in the Second World War. Part 1. The Forging of a Deceiver. Harold Moore before the Bulge. To understand the improbable events of December 22nd to 24th, 1944, one must first understand the man at the radio. Harold Joseph Moore was not a born warrior from central casting. Born in 1920 in Petoskey, Michigan, he was the son of a railroad conductor and grew up in the rugged, forested landscape of the Upper Peninsula. This environment instilled in him a deep practical knowledge of terrain, silence, and observation, skills that would later define his military role. A good student with a particular aptitude for mathematics and logic, Moore attended Michigan State College, now university, before the war. He was described by classmates as quietly confident, more analytical than boisterous, with a sharp, observant mind that missed little. When the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor, Moore, like millions of his generation, enlisted. His intellect and calm demeanor marked him for leadership, and he was sent to officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry, Moore's aptitudes steered him away from a standard rifle platoon. His superiors noted his methodical nature, his clear communication style, and his ability to process disparate pieces of information into a coherent picture. He was assigned to an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, the eyes and ears of a regiment. The I&R platoon was an elite unit within the infantry, composed of soldiers chosen for their initiative, fieldcraft, and intelligence. They operated ahead of the main force, scouting enemy positions, patrolling gaps in the line, and maintaining communication links. Moore excelled in this role. He learned the intricate technical specifications and capabilities of Allied and German radio equipment. He studied German tactical manuals, understanding their standard operating procedures for attack, defense, and reconnaissance. Most importantly, he learned the psychology of the battlefield, the pervasive fog of war, the paranoia of soldiers in contact, the critical importance of timing and information. He saw his first combat in Normandy after D-Day, moving through the bloody hedgerows. Later, he fought in the brutal campaign to liberate Holland during Operation Market Garden. In these battles, Moore witnessed the power of deception firsthand, how a well-placed dummy position could draw devastating enemy fire, how a single sniper could pin down an entire company, how a cleverly faked radio transmission could cause an enemy unit to hesitate or withdraw. He filed these lessons away, not as theoretical concepts, but as practical tools. By the time his unit was rushed by truck into the Ardennes to counter the German breakthrough, Lieutenant Moore was a seasoned, if young, veteran. He was not a gung-ho hero seeking glory. He was a problem solver. His courage was of the cerebral, resilient kind, the courage to think clearly when all around was chaos. As his platoon dug shallow foxholes in the frozen dirt outside Bastogne, listening to the ominous sounds of a gathering storm, all his training, all his observation, and all his quiet intellect converged on a single terrible problem: how to survive the next hour. Part 2. The Canvas of Crisis. The Siege of Bastogne. Bastogne's value was purely geographical. It sat at the junction of 7 hard-topped roads that crisscrossed the Ardennes, the essential network for moving men and machines.
Whoever held Bastogne controlled the logistical heart of the region. For the attacking Germans, it was a stubborn roadblock slowing the momentum of their northern spearhead. For the Allies, it was a dagger pointed at the flank of any German force that bypassed it. General Dwight Eisenhower and his commanders understood this, which is why they ordered the 101st Airborne, though not fully equipped for a defensive siege, to hold Bastogne at all costs. The 101st's commander, Major General Taylor, was in Washington, D.C. when the offensive began. Command fell to his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Facing him was the German 47th Panzer Corps, led by the capable General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherrn von Luttwitz, who had at his disposal elements of the elite 2nd Panzer Division and the 26th Volks.
The Panzer and the poker game. Just after noon, the deep-throated growl of a tank engine cut through the cold air. Through the mist, the low, menacing shape of a German Mark IV Panzer materialized on the road. Its long 75mm gun swept back and forth. Behind it, a full platoon of infantry fanned out. This was no probing squad. This was a deliberate assault. A radio ruse might confuse infantry, but a tank commander, encased in steel, was a harder target for psychological warfare. Moore felt a cold sweat break out beneath his layers of clothing. The bazooka team, PFC's Andy Jackson and Lenny Moretti, slithered into position. They had 2 rounds. The odds of a 2-man bazooka team stopping a Panzer-supported assault were astronomically low. Moore grabbed the radio handset again. This time, his performance had to be perfect. It was no longer about creating a vague impression of strength. It was about selling a single, devastating, and imminent fact. He switched to a different, commonly used artillery frequency. In a calm, utterly controlled forward observer's drawl, he began to transmit. His voice betrayed no panic, only the cool professionalism of a man calling down the wrath of the gods. All Thunderbird batteries, this is Forward Observer Viking 1. Fire mission, urgent, converging fire, grid tear sugar 784312. Enemy armor in the open, infantry in support. 1 Mark IV, coordinates confirmed. Time on target 30 seconds. All batteries, fire for effect. He gave the precise map coordinates of the Panzer's location. He used the correct call sign for the 101st's artillery, Thunderbird. He employed the standard, concise language of a trained artillery spotter. Then he repeated the command, adding, "Adjust fuse to quick. I say again, quick. Shot. Over." He clicked off the handset. The woods were silent, save for the idling rumble of the Panzer. Inside that steel hull, the German commander, likely a veteran of the Eastern Front, was faced with a brutal dilemma. The transmission he had just heard was chillingly authentic. An American forward observer had just called a full artillery concentration directly onto his position. Was it real? Was there a hidden observer watching him right now? If it was real, in 30 seconds his tank would be obliterated in a storm of high explosive and shrapnel. If it was a bluff, he would lose face and momentum. The seconds ticked by. 10, 20. The Panzer's engine revved. Moore held his breath, his hand clenched so tight around the handset his knuckles were white. At 25 seconds, the tank's turret stopped traversing. With a loud clank and a roar of its engine, it abruptly reversed, crashing back into the cover of the trees. The supporting infantry, seeing their armor withdraw, quickly followed suit. A wave of dizzying relief washed over the American position. They had held, not with steel, but with a fiction. Moretti, the bazooka gunner, let out a shaky laugh. "How, Lieutenant, I almost ducked myself." But Moore knew the game was not over. It had only just begun. The Germans would be back. They would analyze the transmission. They might try to triangulate his radio signal. The ruse had to evolve, to become more elaborate, more believable. He had to become the architect of an entire phantom defense. The Symphony of Deception, 48 hours on the ether. What followed over the next 2 days was a masterclass in psychological operations, improvised in real time under extreme duress. Moore transformed his radio into the command nexus of a non-existent force. He created a detailed oral fiction populated with specific units, commanders, and capabilities. The cast of phantoms. He invented the first provisional battalion composed of Echo, Baker, Dog, and Fox companies. He gave them commanders with names: Captain Riley of Echo, Lieutenant Vance of the mortar platoon. He referenced the TD section, tank destroyers on the high ground, and a heavy weapons company with .30 and .50 caliber machine guns interlocking their fields of fire. The soundscape of war. Moore orchestrated a soundscape to sell the illusion. He had his men simulate the sounds of digging at night. They clanged shovels against rocks, dropped empty ammunition boxes, and called out fake supply requests like, "More belts for the .30 on the left." One soldier with a talent for mimicry would occasionally shout orders in a different voice, impersonating Captain Riley. The radio drama. His radio transmissions became a serialized drama. He would call for status reports from his phantom companies. "Baker, report your ammunition status." Pause. "Understood. Low on 60 millimeter, but plenty of small arms. Hold your position." He would fake logistical traffic, complaining to a fictitious headquarters about a shortage of grenades for Dog Company, then thanking them for the promised resupply of anti-tank mines. He created a narrative of a well-supplied, confident, and heavily armed unit, deeply dug in and waiting. Movement as theater. Understanding that German observers would be watching, he used movement as misdirection. He had 2 or 3 men, covered by a white sheet, crawl to new positions every few hours, creating the impression of constant reinforcement and rotation of troops. At dusk, he would have men light small shielded fires in several different locations, suggesting multiple unit cook sites.
Exploiting German doctrine. Moore's knowledge of German tactics was key. He knew they relied on aggressive reconnaissance to find gaps. So, he created the impression of a gap where none existed. He would have his radio go silent on a sector for a while, then suddenly erupt with frantic, fake traffic. "They're probing the gap between Baker and Dog. Fox, shift your machine gun to cover it. Sniper team to grid 780310 now." This would lure a German patrol into what they thought was a weak spot, only to be met with a sudden, real burst of fire from Moore's concealed men, who then immediately shifted position. To the Germans, it confirmed the presence of a fluid, responsive defense. The strain on Moore was immense. He slept in catnaps, his mind constantly racing ahead to the next act in the play. He had to maintain absolute consistency in his fictional world, remember every detail he had invented, and project unshakable confidence to his own men, whose lives depended on the success of his charade. The Germans, for their part, were thoroughly confused. Prisoners captured later in other sectors reported their intelligence officers were convinced a fresh, full-strength American battalion, possibly even a regiment, was holding the Sennenschamps Road. German attack plans were redrawn. Precious artillery fire, desperately needed elsewhere, was directed at Moore's phantom positions, exploding harmlessly in empty woods. Most critically, the main axis of the German attack on the western perimeter was shifted away from Moore's sector toward what they perceived as a softer spot. Moore's deception had successfully diverted a significant portion of the enemy's combat power. Part 6. The Relentless Grip of Reality. While Moore waged his war of illusions, the very real and brutal siege of Bastogne ground on. The men of the 101st were suffering terribly. Casualties mounted in fierce, close-quarters fighting in towns like Marvy and Champs.
The surgical aid stations in Bastogne were overwhelmed, operating with dwindling supplies of plasma, morphine, and bandages. The cold continued to claim men, turning minor wounds into death sentences. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. The skies cleared to a brilliant, cold blue. The roar of aircraft engines replaced the moan of the wind, not German, but American. C-47 Dakotas, braving fierce flak, filled the sky, dropping parachutes of precious supplies, ammunition, medical kits, food, and artillery shells. The sight was a colossal morale booster. That same day, the first fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command appeared, strafing and bombing German positions and columns with devastating effect. Moore watched the aerial ballet from his foxhole, a faint hope stirring. But the air support also meant his radio deception became even more critical. Now he could add a new, terrifying layer to his fiction. When a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts circled overhead, Moore grabbed his radio. "Thunderbird lead, this is Viking 1 on the ground. We have marked enemy assembly area with yellow smoke at grid 785298. Troop concentration, heavy weapons. Can you engage? Over." He had no yellow smoke. The grid was in a deep, empty forest ravine. But the P-47 pilot, hearing a clear, professional request from what he assumed was a legitimate forward air controller, responded, "Roger Viking 1, tally your smoke, rolling in." Minutes later, the forest a kilometer from Moore's position erupted in a series of earth-shaking explosions as 500-pound and 50-caliber rockets tore into it. To the Germans watching nearby, the message was clear. The Phantom Battalion had direct, responsive air support. Their respect for and fear of the unit on their front grew. However, reality also intruded with violence. On the afternoon of the 23rd, a German mortar barrage, inaccurate but wide, bracketed Moore's position. Shrapnel whistled through the trees. One of his men, PFC Charlie Chip Henderson, a 19-year-old radio operator from Ohio, was hit in the leg by a large, jagged fragment. The wound was bad, a deep, bleeding gash. Moore's medical training kicked in. He applied a tourniquet, stuffed sulfa powder into the wound, and bandaged it as best he could, but Henderson needed a surgeon. Evacuation to Bastogne was impossible. The road was under fire. They were trapped. Moore faced an ethical dilemma. Calling for a medic on the radio would reveal his position was a casualty collection point, undermining the fiction of a large, dispersed unit, yet he could not let Henderson die. He devised a solution that turned necessity into part of the deception. He got on the radio, his voice etched with a new, convincing strain. "Watchtower to all points. Casualty at my CP. Need stretcher bearers from Baker Company to grid 784315. Medic required. Urgent. Enemy likely observed impact. Possible adjustment fire incoming. Move fast and under cover." He then had two of his men, under the cover of a small smoke grenade they had been saving, simulate moving a stretcher to the rear, grunting and calling out instructions as they went. To any German listener, it sounded like a routine, organized casualty evacuation within a large unit, a sign of professional resilience, not vulnerability. Henderson was kept as comfortable as possible in a deep foxhole. He would survive, evacuated days later when the siege was lifted. Part 7. The Tide Turns. Patton's Thunderbolt and the Breaking of the Ring. While Moore and the defenders of Bastogne hung on by their fingernails, the Allied High Command was acting with remarkable speed. Eisenhower released his strategic reserves. To the south, General George Patton's Third Army performed one of the staggering feats of military maneuver in history. Ordered to disengage from its own offensive in the Saar, wheel 90 degrees to the north and attack toward Bastogne, the Third Army covered over 100 miles in brutal winter conditions in just 72 hours. On December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army, specifically Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, broke through the German cordon south of Bastogne at the town of Bastogne. A narrow, tenuous corridor was opened. Supplies and reinforcements began to trickle in. The siege was not over, but the noose had been loosened. The news crackled over Moore's radio from Division HQ. The relief force had linked up. The message was simple: hold on, we're coming. For Moore's platoon, the immediate pressure began to ease that same day. The German attacks on their sector, which had diminished into cautious probes after the 24th, ceased entirely. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that the German Corps commander, convinced a major American force blocked the Sennenschamps Road, had withdrawn the units facing Moore to bolster the southern flank against Patton's onslaught. On the morning of the 23rd, as a pale winter sun rose, the men of the I&R platoon heard a new sound from the west, not the rumble of panzers, but the distinctive high-pitched whine of American Sherman tank engines. A column of the 4th Armored Division, having secured the corridor, was pushing out to widen the perimeter. A Sherman crunched through the snow into Moore's position, its turret swiveling vigilantly.
A tank commander, his face grimy and exhausted, popped his hatch. "You boys part of the 101st?" he called down. Moore, standing up from his foxhole for the first time in days, his uniform filthy and frost-rimed, simply nodded. "Hell of a place to spend Christmas," the tanker said with a grim smile. "We heard this sector was held by a whole damn battalion. You see 'em?" Moore looked around at his 18 surviving men, at the silent, snow-draped woods they had defended with a story. He looked at the radio, its housing scarred by shrapnel. A faint, weary smile touched his lips. "They were here," Harold Moore said. "They were definitely here." Part 8. Legacy. The Anatomy of a Mirage. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on until late January 1945, ultimately resulting in a crushing defeat for Germany, which expended its last strategic reserves to no avail. Bastogne became a symbol of American tenacity. For his actions from December 22nd to 24th, Lieutenant Harold J. Moore was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation read, in part, "for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." By his ingenious and repeated use of radio deception, Lieutenant Moore created the convincing illusion of a major defensive force, causing the enemy to divert critical assets and delaying their advance for approximately 48 hours, which contributed directly to the successful defense of the Bastogne perimeter. Moore was promoted to captain and served through the end of the war in Europe. He returned to Michigan, married, raised a family, and worked in civil engineering, rarely speaking of his wartime experiences. When pressed by historians or family, he would deflect praise. "The real heroes were the men in the foxholes who played along," he said in a 1985 interview, "and the ones who didn't make it. I just used a radio. I was scared to death the whole time. The idea wasn't bravery, it was simple arithmetic. We couldn't fight them, so we had to fool them." The military, however, recognized the profound tactical lesson. Moore's actions were studied by the psychological operations community that emerged in the Cold War. His improvisation contained the core principles of successful military deception, known as MILDEC, creating a plausible narrative, the Phantom Battalion, selling it through multiple channels, radio, sound, visual movement, and exploiting the enemy's expectations and fears. Modern military theorists see in Moore's story a precursor to the information warfare of the 21st century. Before cyber units fought for control of digital narratives, a lieutenant in the Ardennes fought for control of a radio frequency narrative. He understood that perception, often more than reality, dictates action on the battlefield. Epilogue: The Substance of Shadows.
Today, the woods near Senonchamps are quiet. The scars of war have long been healed by time and growth. A small, unassuming monument stands near the road, placed by Belgian historians, commemorating the Phantom Battalion and the INR platoon of the 423rd. Hal Moore passed away in 2001 at the age of 81. He is buried in his hometown, a simple stone marking his grave. His story is not one of epic charges or dramatic last stands. It is a quieter, more cerebral kind of heroism. It is the story of a man who, when confronted with an impossible tactical problem, did not choose between fight or flight. He chose a third way, to think. In the frozen crucible of the Bulge, he proved that the most formidable fortification can be one built in the enemy's mind, that the most potent artillery can be a well-crafted sentence, and that courage can wear the guise of a calm voice in the static, weaving a shield of phantoms that for 2 critical days held back the tide of steel. His legacy is a timeless lesson in warfare and human psychology. Sometimes, to hold the line, one must first dare to imagine it.